All right, let's kick off another deep dive. Today, we're taking a look at a book that's really made some waves, especially among Christians.
Yeah, The Two Babylons by Alexander Hislop.
Definitely caused a stir.
It has. So you've probably heard some of the buzz around it, the idea that modern Roman Catholicism is actually rooted in, get this, ancient Babylonian paganism.
It's pretty out there theory, isn't it?
It is. Hislop's book was published way back in 1853, and he argues that so many practices and beliefs we associate with Catholicism, stuff like Christmas, Easter, even some core doctrines, he thinks they're actually derived from ancient Babylonian mysteries.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's break this down a bit. Hislop makes some pretty bold connections, and he starts right off the bat with the biblical figure of Nimrod. He basically paints Nimrod as the foundation of this whole Babylonian system that supposedly infiltrated Christianity. So how did he even begin to make that connection?
Yeah. Well, Hislop leans heavily on symbolism. He links Nimrod to all these different figures, like the Babylonian god Bel, the Greek god Kronos, and even the Roman god Saturn.
Okay, I'm seeing a pattern here. Lots of different cultures, different time periods.
Right. And his primary piece of evidence is the horned bull symbol. He sees it as this representation of power, like a thread that ties all these seemingly unrelated figures together.
So he's using ancient coins, sculptures. I've even heard he brings in zodiac signs to build this intricate web of connections.
He does, yeah.
But is symbolism alone enough to prove a direct lineage? Like, how reliable is that as historical evidence?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's a question a lot of Hislop's critics bring up. Symbolism can be interpreted in so many different ways, and just relying on it to connect cultures that are so far apart in time and space, well, it can be pretty problematic.
I mean, there could be other explanations for those similarities,
Right.
Like cultural exchange, maybe just coincidences.
That's it.
Okay, so Hislop doesn't stop with Nimrod. He goes on to claim that Nimrod's wife, Semiramis, is the original Queen of Heaven figure, and he connects her to the worship of goddesses like Ishtar and Astarte. And then he takes it even further.
Yeah, he links Semiramis to figures like Venus in Roman mythology, Rhea in Greek mythology, and this is the one that really gets people talking, the Virgin Mary in Catholicism. It's like he's drawing a straight line from ancient goddesses to this central figure in Catholic tradition.
Oh, hold on. So are we saying that Catholics venerating Mary is just a rebranded form of ancient goddess worship? I mean, that seems like a pretty big jump to make.
That's essentially what Hislop is arguing. He sees those titles, Queen of Heaven and Mother of God, as evidence for this connection. And he even claims that Mary's role as an intercessor and mediator in Catholicism, it echoes the role of these ancient goddesses.
But couldn't you say that those titles and roles have totally different meanings and significance depending on the context? I mean, Catholicism is very clear that worship is for God alone, and Mary is venerated for her specific role in God's plan. It's not the same thing as worshiping a goddess.
You're absolutely right. It's so important to consider the theological and historical context of these figures and beliefs. Catholicism developed over centuries. It draws on specific biblical texts and theological interpretations. It's not just a copy and paste of ancient Babylonian religion.
Right, right. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about another one of Hislop's claims that I find really intriguing. He suggests that the story of Tammuz, the son of Nimrod and Semiramis, is the origin of the whole dying and rising God myth.
Okay, yeah.
And he connects this directly to the Christian concept of the Messiah. He even claims that holidays like Christmas and Easter have pagan roots.
Yeah, he argues that the date of December 25th for Christmas was picked because it just happened to be the same day as ancient Roman winter solstice celebrations, for the sun god Sol Invictus. And he suggests that even things like gift-giving and feasting, they were all borrowed from these pagan celebrations.
So is he saying Christmas is basically just a pagan holiday in disguise?
That's kind of the implication, yeah. And it's caused a lot of controversy, especially for certain Christian groups. It's important to remember that, the early church didn't celebrate Christmas on December 25th. The actual date of Jesus' birth is unknown.
Right.
But is that enough to say that the Christian meaning and significance of Christmas is invalid? It's a tough question.
Yeah, it really makes you think. How do we separate possible cultural influences from the core beliefs and practices of a religion? And how much weight should we really give to these historical connections, especially when they're based on interpretations of symbolism that can be pretty subjective?
really good questions, and those are some of the questions we'll be grappling with as we go even deeper into Hislop's arguments. But there's no denying that Hislop's book brings up some important points about critical thinking, especially when it comes to religious history. We have to be careful about evaluating sources, understanding potential biases, and not jumping to conclusions based on just surface-level similarities.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've seen that Hislop relies heavily on symbolism and these connections between figures from ancient times and modern practices to build his case. But how well does this approach hold up under scrutiny? What are the limitations of this methodology? And are there other ways to explain these apparent connections? We'll explore those questions in the next part of our deep dive into the two Babylons. Okay, so we've unpacked some of the core arguments that Hislop makes in the two Babylons, and I gotta say, it's a pretty compelling narrative, at least on the surface. But I'm curious, how has the academic world responded to his claims? Has his work been embraced by, like, historians and theologians?
Ah, that's where things get a little tricky. While Hislop's book has definitely been influential, especially among certain Christian groups, it hasn't exactly been a hit with mainstream scholarship.
Really? So what are some of the main criticisms that scholars have leveled against Hislop's work?
Well, one of the biggest criticisms is his reliance on sources that some scholars consider to be, well, outdated or unreliable. He often cites these 19th century historians and antiquarians, but their interpretations of ancient history have been, challenged or revised by more recent scholarship.
So it's like he's building this whole argument on a foundation that's, well, maybe not so solid. If the sources themselves are questionable, then any conclusions you draw from them are going to be less convincing, right?
Right, exactly. Another criticism is that Hislop often takes these ancient myths and symbols out of context. He interprets them through this very specific lens to fit his narrative.
So he's kind of cherry picking.
Yeah, you could say that. Critics argue that he's basically imposing a Christian framework onto ancient Babylonian beliefs, and that can easily lead to misinterpretations and, well, distorted conclusions.
So it's not just about the sources themselves, it's also about how those sources are being used and interpreted.
Precisely. For example, when Hislop tries to connect the Babylonian concept of a triune God to the Christian Trinity, he's making a pretty big leap. Sure, there might be some superficial similarities on the surface, but the actual meanings and theological implications of these concepts are, worlds apart.
So just because two different cultures have a concept of three gods or three aspects of the divine, it doesn't automatically mean they're directly related or that one influenced the other.
Exactly. It's really important to remember that the Christian doctrine of the Trinity developed over centuries, influenced by specific biblical texts and all these theological debates. It's not like they just borrowed it from Babylonian beliefs.
Okay, so Hislop's methodology seems to be all about finding these similarities and then declaring them as proof of direct descent. But couldn't these similarities be explained by other things like cultural exchange or, just the fact that humans across different time periods have grappled with similar questions about existence in the universe?
That's a really crucial point. Cultures and religions, they don't exist in these little bubbles. They interact with each other, they borrow ideas from one another, and they adapt practices to fit their own specific contexts. Hislop's approach seems to kind of downplay the complexity of these cultural exchanges.
It seems like he's drawing these straight lines between ancient Babylon and modern Christianity, but in reality, the historical picture is probably a lot more nuanced and interconnected.
Exactly. And that's why so many scholars argue that Hislop's conclusions just aren't supported by the historical evidence. There's no clear, convincing line of descent between ancient Babylonian paganism and modern Roman Catholicism like he claims.
Okay, so we've talked about the academic criticisms of Hislop's work, but I'm also curious about the impact his book has had beyond, scholarly circles. You mentioned earlier that the two Babylons has been really influential among certain Christian groups. Can you tell me more about that?
Absolutely. Even though Hislop's claims have been largely rejected by mainstream scholarship, they've really resonated with groups who have wanted to distance themselves from mainstream Christianity. These groups often see themselves as trying to restore a purer form of Christianity, free from what they believe are, pagan influences that have corrupted traditional denominations.
So it sounds like Hislop's book has given them a kind of historical narrative to justify their separation and to reinforce their own specific beliefs and practices.
Exactly. Groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses, Armstrongism, Hebrew Roots, they've all been influenced by the two Babylons to varying degrees. They often cite Hislop's work as evidence that mainstream Christianity, particularly Catholicism, has strayed from the true teachings of the Bible.
So even though his claims haven't held up under academic scrutiny, they found an audience among groups that were already kind of skeptical of traditional Christian institutions.
Exactly. And it raises some important questions about the role of history in shaping religious beliefs and identities.
Yeah.
How do we approach these historical claims, especially when they're being used to support specific theological viewpoints or to justify separatist movements?
Yeah, it reminds us that history can be a powerful tool, and it's really important to use it responsibly, to be aware of potential biases and to avoid using the past to promote division or prejudice. Hislop's work, even though it's controversial, offers a really valuable case study in how complex the relationship is between history, religion, and how people form their beliefs.
It's pretty amazing to think about how a book written over a century ago can still have such a huge impact on the religious landscape today. Hislop's work has sparked all these debates, fueled divisions, and even prompted people to re-examine their own beliefs and the historical foundations of their faith.
This deep dive into the two Babylons has really highlighted how crucial critical thinking is, especially when we're dealing with these controversial historical claims. We've explored Hislop's main arguments, looked at the criticisms, and considered the lasting impact of his book, especially on certain parts of Christianity.
But there's one more thing we need to talk about. The Two Babylons wasn't just about uncovering historical connections. It also had a message, a warning about the dangers of paganism and the importance of purifying Christianity from its supposed corrupting influences. So, what does this message even mean for us today? How do we navigate this complex relationship between history, religion, and how we form our own beliefs? That's what we'll be talking about in the final part of our deep dive.
We spent this deep dive really getting into the weeds with the two Babylons, looking at the claims, the impact, all that. And it's obvious Hislop felt pretty strongly on what he saw as, this pagan corruption of Christianity. But what does that actually mean for people today? Like the average person trying to figure out their own faith.
Right. Well, it's super important to remember the context that Hislop was writing in. I mean, this is 19th century Britain, a time of huge changes, both religiously and socially.
Yeah, lots of upheaval.
Yeah, and his book, with its warnings about paganism, and this need for a pure, uncorrupted form of Christianity, it really struck a chord with people.
People who felt like the established churches were, I don't know, maybe failing them somehow.
Exactly. They were looking for something they saw as more authentic.
So kind of tapping into this anxiety about the state of Christianity at the time, like a longing to get back to some sort of pristine, original version of the faith.
That's it, exactly. And that sentiment, this desire for purity, for authenticity, it's still around today. We see it in all sorts of movements and groups that are all about getting back to the Bible, rejecting tradition.
And separating themselves from what they see as compromised or kind of tainted versions of Christianity. So Hislop's work has almost provided a framework, a historical narrative for some of these groups. It helps them make sense of their own beliefs and justify why they've split from mainstream denominations.
Yeah, totally. It's become this key text for groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses, who see themselves as restoring true worship.
By rejecting what they consider pagan-influenced doctrines and practices.
Right. And Hislop's stuff about the origins of holidays like Christmas.
Like how he says Christmas has pagan roots.
Yeah. That's led some groups to stop celebrating it altogether.
Wow. So it's not just an intellectual exercise. Hislop's work has actually had a real impact on how people live out their faith, how they understand the Bible, even how they view other Christian groups.
No question. And this really highlights a key point.
Yeah.
History isn't just about memorizing dates and names. It shapes our understanding of the world today, influences our beliefs, and can even motivate our actions.
It's a good reminder that we can't just accept historical claims blindly, especially when it comes to religion. We got to look at them with a critical eye. Because these claims can have consequences. They can affect how people live and how they treat each other.
Absolutely. One of the things that really stands out about the two Babylons is this emphasis on drawing really stark lines, like good versus evil, true religion versus false religion.
Right, very black and white.
Yeah, it's this very clear-cut view of history and faith.
And that can be comforting, can it? In a world that often feels so chaotic and confusing, it feels good to have these simple narratives, to feel certain about right and wrong.
I get that, totally. But it's crucial to remember that history is rarely that straightforward. The boundaries between cultures and religions, they're often blurred. Ideas and practices, they evolve and mix together. It's not always easy to trace things back to their origins with complete certainty.
So, while Hislop has definitely gotten people thinking and encouraged us to be more critical about how history might have influenced our beliefs, It's important to avoid getting stuck in a rigid or dogmatic way of interpreting history.
Yeah, we have to be open to nuance, to different interpretations, and to the fact that our understanding of the past is always changing. New evidence pops up, scholarly opinions shift.
This whole deep dive into the two Babylons has really shown us just how complicated the relationship is between history, religion, and how our beliefs are formed. It reminds us that we all come to the table with our own perspectives and biases when we're trying to understand the past.
And that's exactly why it's so important to have these conversations, to question our assumptions, and to be willing to learn from each other. Hislop's book, as controversial as it is, has really sparked important discussions. It's made us think about the historical roots of our own faith and all the different ways that Christianity has been understood and practiced through the ages.
It's been quite a journey, wouldn't you say, exploring these claims, the criticisms, and the lasting impact of the two Babylons. We hope this deep dive has encouraged you, our listeners, to think critically about historical claims, to be open to different perspectives, and to keep exploring this rich and complex world of religious history. Thanks for joining us.